I want to express my appreciation for the invitation and to all of the background work of Abigail Bacon, who always helps me in numerous ways with all of my research. I'm always deeply grateful to her, to Laura Wilson and the staff here at the Clow. My deep appreciation. Here in Cincinnati, we study, read, and research on holy ground. Today, we're gathered in one of the greatest libraries of Judaica in the world. I walked into this building in 1975, and I have never left. This campus and this building have shaped my life in ways for which I continue to be profoundly grateful. Today's lecture is an inadequate statement of gratitude for all those who have built and sustained this treasure. May it continue so for future generations. With me today is Dr. Carol Lehman, who has supported and encouraged my engagement with the world of this library and its surrounding for 25 years. Thank you. In the early 1990s, I was sitting in the garden of the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem around noon, doing some work on my computer. It was necessary during those years to spend time in Jerusalem if you were working on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sitting down beside me at the table while opening her first beer of the day, a retired Dutch archaeologist glanced over at my computer and noticed the list of files, the DOS files at that time on my computer. Murder, vengeance, adultery, divorce, enemies. What are you working on? My reply, the Sermon on the Mount. A quizzical expression was the only reply. While working on various texts among the Dead Sea Scrolls, I had been observing connections with the Gospel of Matthew. Many years later, my book on Matthew is an attempt to make sense of those observations. The Gospel of Matthew is the first book of the collection called the New Testament in the Christian Bible. It's usually been considered to be the most Jewish gospel for a variety of reasons, including the tradition that it was originally composed in Hebrew or Aramaic. This view was related to the belief that Matthew was the oldest of the four gospels, thereby undergirding its authoritative status for issues of faith and practice in the Western Christian Church. This was the reigning hypothesis until the advent of literary criticism in the 18th century, when the theory of Markan priority took hold and gained ascendancy. This is the hypothesis that Mark was a primary source of both Matthew and Luke. For the sake of brevity, I will in this lecture refer to the literary work, the Gospel of Matthew, simply as Matthew. This is not an assertion related to authorship. The earliest evidence for a Hebrew version of Matthew is that ascribed to Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis, from 130 to 140 BCE, and cited by Eusebius, the 5th century church historian. I just noted Abigail circulating a text that has chapter 5 of Matthew and some other texts on it that you might find helpful. What Papias said was that now Matthew collected the sayings in the Hebrew language and each translated them as best he could. What exactly the sayings in Greek would have meant is not clear. It's very doubtful that this was a Semitic version of the text as we know it. The first mention that Matthew was the first gospel to be written is attributed to Origen, in the 3rd century, followed by Irenaeus and then Jerome in the 5th century. Evidence that this composition was the object of attention in the Jewish community is also available. A remarkable example is the version of Matthew found in the Evan Bohan, a polemical work from 1380, edited and translated by an HUC graduate, George Howard. The belief in a Semitic original for Matthew was also held by the Christian Hebraists of the 16th and 17th centuries. And there's a sample in the display case behind me here. The New Testament evidence does come into play with Jewish thinkers of the Haskalah movement of the 19th century, such as Abraham HUC-JIR. However, their major interest is the evidence concerning the Pharisees and the Sadducees. For HUC-JIR, Jesus was a Pharisee whose teaching should be seen within the context of an early form of rabbinic Judaism. This leads into the works of the early 20th century Jewish scholars such as Israel Abrahams and Claude G. Montefiore. The latter's description of Matthew reflects the apparent contradictions that modern scholars continue to attempt to understand. He says, it is at once Jewish and anti-Jewish, legal and anti-legal, narrow and anti-Gentile, and also Catholic and Universalist. He assumed that the synagogue and the rabbis were the dominant force in 1st century Jewish life. The approach to this study of the Gospel of Matthew reached its apex in the magisterial volume of W.D. Davies, The Setting of the Sermon on the Mount, published in 1964. While recognizing connections with the Dead Sea Scrolls in discrete statements found in the sermon, he cast it as a Christian response to Yavna. Quote, it is our suggestion that one fruitful way of dealing with the Sermon on the Mount is to regard it as the Christian answer to Jamnia. Using terms very loosely, the Sermon on the Mount is a kind of Christian Mishnaic counterpart to the formulation taking place there. Jamnia or Yavna is the site of the school attributed to Yochanan ben Zakkai at the time of the destruction of the temple and considered to be the foundation of Rabbinic Judaism in traditional modern scholarship. At this time, another HUC graduate, Jack Lewis, published an important article on the significance of Yavna. 2 decades later, Shia Cohen published his very influential article that dominates a good deal of the discussion, even to the present day. The significance of Yavna, Pharisees, rabbis, and the end of Jewish sectarianism. He argued that with the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the various sects came to an end and remnants of their viewpoints were absorbed into the emerging form of Judaism. What about the connection between the Pharisees and the later rabbis? He proposes that while there is no convincing evidence of a connection, in all likelihood there was one. He also demonstrated that the rabbis did not have as much authority in the 2nd century as was attributed to them in earlier traditional scholarship. We're left with the conclusion of Amram Tropper of Ben Gurion University regarding the institutional status of the rabbinic movement. Scattered disciple circles rather than a functioning centralized academy characterized the rabbinic social structure in the Tannaitic period. The rabbis are not in control in these Jewish communities. Of course, this rules out the simplistic comparisons of Jesus and Hillel found in more popular Christian and some Jewish literature. It's within this context that my work on Jewish sectarianism in Matthew becomes relevant. Rather than a Christian response to Yavna, I consider Matthew to be the evidence of one more sectarian Jewish group that was in existence at the end of the 1st century after the destruction of the temple and before the ascendancy of Rabbinic Judaism. Martin Goodman, Martha Himmelfarb, Joshua Ezra Burns, Jody Magnus all have argued for the evidence of the continuation of sectarianism within Jewish life after 70. The definition of sectarianism has always been fraught with difficulty since it originated as a category for attempting to describe the social structure of various Christian groups in the Reformation from a sociological perspective. Two sociologists of religion, Rodney Stark and William Sims Bainbridge, took up this category as they attempted to develop criteria for the description and evaluation of new religious movements. It had already been established by the time they wrote that tension with one's socio-cultural environment was the major sociological characteristic of sectarianism. They understood sect formation as a type of subcultural deviance, which consists of 3 elements: difference, antagonism, and separation. It is this background which informs the very useful definition of sectarianism advanced by Albert Baumgarten, retired from Bar-Ilan University, a voluntary association of protest which utilizes boundary marking mechanisms, the social means of differentiating between insiders and outsiders, to distinguish between its own members and those otherwise normally regarded as belonging to the same national or religious entity. Significant here is the reference to boundary marking mechanisms, indicating who is in and who is out, a determination complicated by the fact that it claims to be the same national or religious entity as those designated by outsiders, or by designated as outsiders. In the case of Matthew, the claim is that the community addressed is part of the house of Israel and represents what is best for the people. Now, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, is the most extensive speech attributed to Jesus in the canonical Gospels, and the first of 5 major discourses scattered throughout the composition. While portions of it are similar to a discourse dubbed the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, the features of its particular structure, its literary structure, suggest a conscious effort and not a random collection of sayings attributed to Jesus. These 3 chapters can be used as an important indicator of major themes in that composition. After all, Matthew says that they are words of Jesus. The first 9 verses of this discourse are commonly called the Beatitudes, based upon the Latin and Greek Macarisms. The first 3 Macarisms include, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." David Flusser, already in 1960, pointed to the connection between these 3 attributes and their appearance in the sectarian writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran. He pointed to the Thanksgiving hymns, and I quote, "In order to raise up the herald of good news according to your truth, and to tell of your goodness, to proclaim good news to the poor according to the abundance of your mercy, and to satisfy from the fount of knowledge all the broken in spirit and those who mourn, that they may have eternal joy." Following that identification, then Flusser pointed to Pesher Psalm 37:11. For those of you not inducted into the mysteries of Dead Sea Scrolls, Pesher means a commentary. on Psalm 37. In this case, the meek shall inherit the earth in the psalm is interpreted as a reference to the assembly of the poor, the name of one of the names of the sect described in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then later on in the exegesis of Psalm 37:22, those who are blessed of him will inherit the earth, again interpreted as a reference to the assembly of the poor. The poor in spirit are named in the Thanksgiving hymns and in the War Scroll. The poor and needy are a constant reference in a variety of compositions from the scrolls, frequently used to designate the members of the sect. While this evidence suggests is that the opening section of the first major address in the Gospel of Matthew serves the purpose of providing an identity for the group of the followers of Jesus associated with it. These Macarisms identify the followers of Jesus as a distinct group to be distinguished from other groups in the Jewish community, and it uses known sectarian signifiers to make its point. This difference is apparent throughout the other 6 examples. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Elsewhere, I have demonstrated that the term righteousness is employed in a manner in Matthew different from other New Testament compositions. It's employed much more frequently than in any of the other Gospels, as is also the case with the adjective righteous. The particular sectarian interpretation of the term utilized here is similar to the sectarian text from Qumran. In both cases of Matthew and Qumran, the term is used to refer to the particular way of life designated for adherents of the sect described in the literature. When we see the phrase later in verse 20, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, it's not referring to an abstract or ill-defined concept. It rather is explicitly saying that the scribes and Pharisees are living out their Jewish way of life, their halakha, in a manner different from that of this sectarian group, the followers of Jesus, and in the view of Matthew, not according to the will of God. In the view of Matthew, these followers of Jesus are the ones who hunger and thirst for righteousness. The pure in heart of verse 8 would be an expectation central to the life outlined in the sectarian text from Qumran, in which the desire to be clean or pure was a central aspiration. The 8th charism, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Peacemaking as one of the characteristics of this sectarian group seems to be significant, since later in the same chapter of the antitheses, you read, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Perhaps this is a direct response to members of the same sectarian group described in the Jewish community who presented their understanding of the will of God in a very different manner, as we've already outlined. For example, in the community rule of the Dead Sea materials, we read, those admitted to the covenant shall walk perfectly in love all the children of light, each commensurate with his rightful place in the council of God, and to hate all the children of darkness, each commensurate with his guilt and the vengeance due him from God. Whatever the implications of being designated peacemakers in Matthew, it appears to be in direct opposition to views held by another sectarian group. Of course, stories such as those concerning Yochanan ben Zakkai during the Roman siege of the temple, and the later attribution to Hillel, be of the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace. These do point to peace as an ongoing value in Jewish life. The final extended Makarism is significant and indicative. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice, be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Notice the phrase, on my account. The familiarity of this phrase belies its significance. The Second Temple Jewish composition that most resembles the Makarisms of Matthew is a text from the Qumran that has been called Beatitudes. There also we find a list of carefully constructed Makarisms, followed by an extended conclusion containing an exhortation to diligence in the face of adversity, followed by the promise of reward. Blessed is the man who attains wisdom. He walks in the law of the Most High. He does not leave her with the afflictions of his distress, and during the period of anguish, he does not abandon her. He does not forget her in the days of terror, and with the humility of his soul, he does not despise her. The major difference between the two, in this Makarism, the cause of distress, anguish, and terror is the adherent's attachment to the law of the Most High, rather than in Matthew, the elliptical phrase, on my account. The comparison demonstrates the manner in which Matthew has replaced wisdom and Torah with Jesus. Matthew portrays Jesus as the authoritative spokesperson for knowing the will of God for the Jewish people. But we must recall that Matthew was written between 80 and 100 CE. That's after the destruction of the temple and after the life of Jesus. Jesus is regarded as the revered founder. What does it mean to be this, a member of this community in the years 80 to 100? It is to do what Matthew says that Jesus said and did. From both the narrative development of the figure of Jesus in the story and from a sociological analysis of the sectarian text rhetoric employed, this authority is absolute and unequivocal. This opening section of the sermon is shortly followed by another declaration. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. In Hebrew, lakayim et haTorah, to fulfill the law, that's keep or observe it, or levatel et haTorah, to abolish the Torah, that's to negate it or break it by not observing it. A similar construction is found in Bavli Shabbat 116b. Of some consequence is the attention paid by Matthew to anomia, lawlessness. Such is not the case in the other gospel accounts. This emphasis in Matthew is lost in English translation. For example, in the conclusion of the sermon in Matthew 7:23, the NRSV reads, "Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Get away from me, you evildoers." A more literal translation would be, "You workers of lawlessness." The argument being made by Matthew is that Jesus' teaching about the law is the only correct one, and claims about what the law says made by other Jewish leaders are incorrect and lawless. This is not without precedent in Second Temple Jewish life. The malleable nature of the content of Torah in the Second Temple era is topic of another lecture. In this case, it means that the community is to follow the law as it was advanced by Jesus rather than the manner suggested by other Jewish leaders at the time. Similarly, in the community rule, new members are inducted by swearing to uphold the law of Moses, but that law includes the community rules governing the sect. They're all Torah. The remainder of the chapter is composed of 6 examples or cases set out to illustrate through example the Torah being advanced for the members of the Matthew community. For the sake of time, permit a few comments. The first case, you have heard that it was said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. When the teaching to be contradicted is cited, it might sound like a quotation from Torah, and in some cases it is. In this first instance, the initial portion of the citation is one of the commandments, you shall not murder. The second half, whoever murders is liable to judgment, is not as clear a case and may rather point to some of the legal requirements in other works associated with the Qumran material, such as Jubilees and the Temple Scroll, as well as other biblical allusions. The most well-known example that appears to point directly to Qumran literature is the one already mentioned from verse 33, already mentioned above. You shall love your neighbor, not as yourself, as we might expect from Leviticus 19:18, but rather you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. What is remarkable in these cases is the response of Jesus. But I say to you, Matthew again places in the words of Jesus an audacious claim for authority. Rabbinic exemplars do not make arguments about the meaning of Torah in this manner. David Daba, of blessed memory, a master of biblical, Talmudic, and Roman law, with whom I was able to spend a couple of summers in Berkeley, noted that in contrast to rabbinic argumentation, the tone is not academic, but final, prophetic, maybe somewhat defiant, nor is there any reasoning. It is an authoritative teaching, revelation, given by the author of Matthew to those who decided to join the sectarian Jewish community of the follower of Jesus. This chapter closes with the line, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Being perfect is well known from the Qumran scrolls, both in its communal legislation and in its halachic composition, such as the Temple Scroll and 4QMMT, the listing of halachic principles deemed important by a leader. In contrast, this last line, or I consider this last line to be not the conclusion of the discussion of the last case in the chapter, but rather the conclusion of the chapter. These 6 verses from 21 to 47 are bracketed by, in verse 21, the injunction to righteousness, already discussed, and in 48, this final summation with an injunction for perfection, the goal of sectarian life. As is typical of narrative, the conflict from the agenda-setting Sermon on the Mount through successive incidents throughout the narrative comes towards chapter 23, the well-known condemnation, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. In the 2 chapters prior to chapter 23, the reader finds a sequence of parables that contain a much higher level of violence than is evidence in any of the parallels to these stories in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. The same could be said for the apocalyptic discourse that immediately follows chapter 23. All of these leading to the account of the trial and execution of Jesus. Of particular interest in the account of the trial is the manner in which all of the Jewish leadership groups including the scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees, as well as the chief priests and elders, are made part of this narrative and implicated in the execution. Today is not the occasion for a major lecture on the literature related to the trial and execution of Jesus. Clearly, it was a Roman execution, since only Roman officials possessed the authority to carry out such a conviction. But two features in particular in Matthew stand out. The first is a one-line reference in chapter 27:19. While Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent, dikaios, righteous man. For today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Here is the first statement Matthew includes declaring Jesus' innocence, a prelude to the well-known reference beginning only 5 verses later. In 27:24, Matthew includes the dramatic scene in which Pilate washes his hands, a visible demonstration of his declaration asserting his own innocence, followed by the verse that has run down through the ages, much to the detriment of the Jewish people. Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." In verse 20, Matthew has already told us that the chief priests and the elders had persuaded the people to ask for Barabbas. In other words, the Jewish leadership has been deceptive and manipulative, a rather common theme throughout the gospel. When we read this account from a sectarian Jewish perspective, we see the condemnation of Jewish leadership common in sectarian apocalyptic texts of the Second Temple era. Matthew has already referred to the scribes and Pharisees as snakes and a brood of vipers in chapter 23. He predicts that they will kill and crucify some of the prophets, sages, and scribes that's Jesus, and in the words of Jesus, of course, now the community of Jesus will send you. Others they will flog you and pursue from town to town. And then continuing, so that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Barachiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Time does not permit an examination of the historical allusions mentioned. But here the Pharisees and Sadducees are charged not only with misleading the Jewish people as a whole, but with the murder of those righteous Jews who are prophesying to the will of God. Rhetorically, it is the same charge addressed against the chief priests and elders in chapter 27. From the viewpoint of this sectarian composition addressed to the followers of Jesus, the Jewish leadership is responsible for the persecution and murder of those who know and proclaim the will of God, including their founder. Here, the sociological tension between this group and the leadership of other groups within the Jewish community is very high. By this point, the narrative of Matthew displays all three features of the sociological tension already mentioned: difference, separation, and antagonism. With that level of tension, knowledge of the will of God for Israel rests exclusively with this sectarian group, as had been the case made in the Qumran literature for an earlier sectarian group. This reading of Matthew does not lead to a comfortable conclusion. A kinder and gentler Matthew that can be used in a simplistic manner to counter biblically based anti-Semitism in the modern world. Perhaps it rather illustrates the problem. The basis of the powerful hold that some of its statements have upon the Christian imagination, its theology, and its belief. This sectarian effort of communal maintenance, of self-identification, and of differentiation within the Jewish community provides a basis for subsequent Christian belief and practice. However, its power does not rest only in its literal words. Its power rests in the sectarian rhetoric of its origins. To the extent that the Gospel of Matthew remains significant in the process of the formation of Christian identity, it is important to recognize that it is rooted in a process of self-differentiation from other segments of the Jewish community. To the extent that this process has its basis in the formation of a sectarian community whose features can be distinguished on the basis of difference, separation, and antagonism, it remains a problematic composition in present attempts to counter anti-Semitism. With this recognition, it must also be recognized as an ambivalent source for providing a basis for Christian tolerance in other areas of social behavior.
Can I share a question by Zoom first?
Please.
Okay, so we have a question from Pat, and you might want to repeat this for our Zoom people. Is being poor in spirit a virtue? People who are really wealthy but are generous and don't flaunt their wealth, or is it an affliction and not enough spirit on the edge of a nervous breakdown?
Okay, is the poor in spirit an affliction or a virtue? Yes, it's both. The important thing here is that it's used as a designator. It's used as a name for the group is the point here.
But do we like the group, or is it, what do we think?
If you're in the group, you like it. And I mean, we use these designators to designate ourselves. So whether they were poor or whether they imagined that they were poor, we don't always know. The important point is that this is the name that they chose to identify themselves. We do have other texts in the scrolls that are very interesting with regard to the poverty. For example, the long wisdom text on instruction is actually literally addresses injunctions to the poor. The addressee in instruction is described as poor, he's described as needy, etc. So the designator here seems to be important, but the precise history of the way it worked within the life of the group is much harder to determine. Question? Yes.
Is the poor in spirit mentally ill or what?
I would be more inclined to understand it primarily to be a reference to a certain status within the hierarchy of the society of that time. And so the poor is related to the designation starts with the status designation that it's related to lower rungs in the society, and some self-understanding of that social status. That's what poor conveys, and doesn't have as much access to resources. Pardon me?
Is it in Greek or in Hebrew? What are the words in Greek and in Hebrew?
Aniye Ruach is one of the, you've got Evion, Rash, you get a wide variety of them in the Hebrew.
Thank you, John, for a really wonderful experience of intertextuality. And I'm wondering if you could, for me anyway, and maybe others, to clarify if there are this many touching points between different sectary expressions of sectarianism, whether it's Dead Sea Scrolls or even later materials. You referenced Avot as having some themes. Does the primary differentiator then of this sectary become the allegiance to the individual Jesus, or can we differentiate other policy issues, if I can use a word like that, or theological issues that would also help us distinguish something else taking place as far as the sectary goes? So really, I'm not trying to make an either or, but when we read the Dead Sea Scrolls, even though there is a teacher of righteousness, we don't have the identity of an individual in this fashion. So would we differentiate this form of sectarianism by virtue of the emphasis on the individual?
And please repeat for the Zoom people. Thank you.
The question is whether whether there are other designators besides the figure of Jesus, and similarly other groups that can be identified as characteristics. Starting with Matthew. I could be deemed heretical here. We don't know much about Jesus. You know, what we know is what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and other gospels said about Jesus. So my reading of Matthew about what Jesus says is a description, can be used as a description of what this author at least wanted that community to be. So in that sense, the designators, that's why I highlight these designators, they're not ones that are particular to Jesus. They're rather ones that are deemed as being significant for this community of the followers of Jesus. And a number of the communities, Danny Schwartz, others have written about the role of the founder, whether real or imagined in these communities, as important in terms of the identity of the group. The returning to the poor, that's actually a fascinating one that caught me by surprise when, as I just mentioned, I started reading Instruction, the only one that I know in which the poor have ethical responsibilities. We don't find any of that sort of, and then when we go into the groups of the 2nd and 3rd century CE, you still have the Ebionites, groups such as this. So these designators that seem to be, and that we in the modern world assume to be kind of philosophical categories, to me seem to be designators that are rooted much more in social experience and designate certain statuses in the group, and tend to be ones that are deemed as for these sectarian groups, rooted usually in apocalyptic, tend to be designators that are viewed as being outside of power, outside of the main groups. Is how I tend to view that. Rick.
Just supporting that and noting what Dr. Aaron has said about textuality here. Yeah, I would agree with you in terms of social designators. And what is equally noteworthy is the, if you will, the chosen designations and terminology. These are the groups whom God cares for in the social legislation of the Torah.
Yeah.
And they take on those identities here.
Okay.
God cares for the poor, those who are socially disadvantaged.
What Dr. Saracen is citing is that some of these social designators tend to have their roots in vocabulary that's related to the outside groups that society is supposed to take care of, or the marginal groups that society is supposed to take care of as designated in the Torah.
The ones who God looks after.
Right, the ones who God looks after and favors.
And some of the prophetic leadership. Right. Yeah, really. Right, that's right.
Yes.
I have to leave shortly, but I thought I'd ask this while I have some time. Can you tell me more about who is Matthew writing to? Is this a predominantly Jewish audience? If so, why is it Greek? Or is this a predominantly Gentile group as Jewish sects?
Yeah.
Who are these people?
I see your professor walking out, so I'll be quick.
I don't get the answer. Everyone else?
From my standpoint, the audience of Matthew is a Jewish group. If we assume Markan priority and we assume a kind of a Pauline origin of Christianity that's scattered around the diaspora, I think that the author of Matthew used Mark and other sources, but was in a situation in Lower Syria, Galilee, somewhere related to resident Jewish communities, and was addressing a Jewish audience. I think the Gentile question in Matthew is rather is a minor one. It's a minor problem in that community, as it would have been in Jewish communities in Galilee in general, in my understanding. And so the fact that it's written in Greek, let's say in Galilee or Lower Syria, does not eliminate the possibility of Jewish authorship in my evaluation.
What are the years that this Matthew was written in comparison with all this Paul stuff was written with?
Well, Paul's letters would have been in the 40s and 50s. Matthew would be 80 to 100 after the destruction of the temple and before the Bar Kokhba revolt. It's that period in between those events in Jewish history.
Has he known Paul?
Presumably, I mean, he knew, obviously he knew Mark. But notice, you see, in my lecture, what I did is I didn't compare them with those Christian writings, because I don't think that he was competing, that Matthew was writing to compete with or to provide a different perspective for those Christian communities of the diaspora that are represented in Mark, Luke, and the legacy of Paul. This is rather a Jew who has some connection with this movement, but is writing within the Jewish community rather than having as a primary interlocutor the other gospels like Mark and Luke. And this is kind of where I depart from most New Testament scholarship in terms of separating out Matthew as that kind of work and trying to understand its distinctive. So reading it very self-consciously within Jewish history, rather than in some of the imagined and some of the real controversies that are reflected in some of the other works related to Christian history.
We have so many questions on Zoom. I don't even know. Let's just do one or two more. Here's one who wants to know, is there a precedent in sectarian literature for a divine Messiah, or is that an innovation of Matthew?
There are all kinds of messiahs in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's why, in terms of the reading of this within the context of Jewish history, I don't concentrate on the Messiah, because there were ample examples we find in Second Temple literature. When I teach this, I have a list of about 20 examples of different types of messiahs that you have in Jewish literature from, let's say, 200 BCE until this. So this is one more Messiah. From a Jewish standpoint, this is one more Messiah. But there's a wide variety of them rather than any one. So in my analysis, I don't think the particular question of Jesus' messiahship is the important one in terms of understanding what Matthew was trying to say in this. The Messiah is part of the belief in the intervention of God in Jewish history. And that is represented in multiple ways. And the Christian way is from the standpoint of Jewish history, one of many options that Caleb selected. And in Matthew himself, you probably find 4 or 5 different Messiah images actually that are dipped into within the options that were available in the first century Jewish literature and community. Michael.
Is there a similar sectarianism in the other gospels to any extent at all?
I don't think so.
We repeat the question.
I'm sorry. Michael Meyer says, is there a similar sectarianism in the other gospels? I don't think so. In fact, it's on its way to publication in one of these. We all write for Oxford volumes these days. I think it's in the Oxford Handbook of the Synoptic Gospels coming out. I'll make that case exactly. That, and this is the impact of Dead Sea Scrolls on the field of Jewish history during this time period. It permits us, if you're interested in early Christian literature, to also make some more acute designations with regard to the nature of the early Christian communities. And I don't think that Mark and Luke, John is a different question. That's a complicated one that I really I've been avoiding. But Mark and Luke, I don't think so. They're written for a diaspora audience that is not as deeply rooted in the sectarian heritage of first century Judea and Galilee. And so I distinguish Matthew very much from those on that point, and suggest that this is a way of understanding why and how Matthew wrote, in contrast to those other gospels that were more addressed to diaspora and Asia Minor. And so I don't think so. That whether did the corresponding question is, did Christianity originate as a sectarian group? And that gets complicated. In this article, I will argue that it didn't. It was an apocalyptic group, but not a sectarian group. But I think that Matthew, with a provenance closer to Judea, Galilee, and the events there, is the only representative actually of a sectarian group. The others are within the apocalyptic tradition, but not explicitly sectarian.
So with regard to the anti-Semitic portions or the things that have become anti-Semitic, I mean, it's clearly rooted in that your taxonomy as it goes toward the antagonism of the sectarian groups that would have been either equal in power or slightly, the Christian sectarian group would have been the least in power, I would think, or had to have the least power. And so it seems that like the history of that antagonism within the sectarian, this kind of sectarian infighting, I guess, or however you want to describe that, leads to this kind of reception of an anti-Semitic thing that becomes the power. When it becomes powerful, like post-Constantinian, becomes a real problem.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we deal with it? It's just saying this, putting it in perspective and saying this was a sectarian group, and this is the result of the antagonism between sectarian groups fighting amongst each other. Is that the only solution that we have to discussing the anti-Semitism of this book?
The question is, basically the question is, well, what do we do? What's the solution to this particular dynamic with regard to, well, ultimately that's another book, but I mean, I think the important thing is it begins with recognition, and to understand that, and then from a Christian standpoint, to be aware of these dynamics in terms of the texts that are used. Ultimately, it pushes us, I think, to other questions. I mean, Amy Jill Levine has done a wonderful job of helping us teach texts in other ways. But I think this is a continuation of the Christian response to the Holocaust. It really still is rooted in that question. And so just as the Jewish world has had to wrestle with the consequences of what does the Holocaust mean for us. So Christian identity also has been rooted in that. And so this is part of that ongoing question. It's not simply a question of making the text right, come out right, because they're not going to. But it's rather, what if we know this, then what challenges does that pose with regard to how we understand Christian identity? And how do we really understand what that means? So I think there's two pieces. One is a fairly simplistic but very important work of getting more of the information about the text correct, and that helps. But that does not resolve the basic identity questions that these texts pose to the Christian world in light of the Holocaust. And I think we need to continue to wrestle with that question.
Thank you. I think it was a perfect one to end on. Thank you very much.